Hi, today we're going to talk about counterarguments and refutations, also known as rebuttals. That's another word for it. So counterarguments and refutations are typically done to make your essay more credible. It basically shows that you're willing to talk about another person's argument, the opposite argument in some cases. If you think about the word counter-argument, counter means against, so it's against your argument. So you're going to be looking at what other people have to say that doesn't agree with what your argument is. Also, when you have that counter-argument, you're not going to just state what someone else believes that is in a disagreement with your argument. You're also going to use a refutation. So you're going to kind of respond back to that and talk about why that opinion or that belief is not quite correct. Okay, so it's a response, reply, okay, you kind of get that idea there. And there's a few more steps that I will talk about that can help make a counter-argument and refutation paragraph stronger and, keep it from just being a counter-argument and refutation, giving it a little bit more depth, okay? So, the steps that I recommend using for the counter-argument and refutation paragraph are these 5 steps. Counter-argument, explain the counter-argument, the concession, the refutation, and then evidence, okay? So we talked a little bit about counter-argument. For that counter-argument, it could be the counter-argument to your entire essay, basically the counter-argument to your thesis. It could also be the counter-argument to one body paragraph or one topic sentence, okay? Just kind of depends on what you feel you will have the most to say about. Many times when my students are writing counter-arguments and refutations for the first time, they will do a counter-argument just on one body paragraph, just because it's a little bit easier to focus in on one and not have to think about the whole thing. But it really depends on, what works best for you. It may also depend on what your instructor wants. Some instructors say, it needs to be for the entire essay, for the thesis, basically. And there are some instructors who are going to want a counter-argument for every single body paragraph. Some will say, just choose one. That's typically what I do, but it really just depends on, what their goals are. Do they want you to focus more on the essay overall, every single argument, or just practice doing a counter-argument? Okay, so that's the counter-argument. The next thing is explaining the counter-argument. For that explanation, this can also include paraphrasing the counter-argument, so putting it in your own words, saying what it means, just giving us a little bit more detail about this. Many times when my students struggle with getting body paragraphs and essays to the length that they need to be, they struggle because they can't explain their ideas. So one way to help with this is to look for words in the counter-argument that may not be clear or that might be a little bit broad, and then pick out those words and explain them a little bit more. Maybe it's ideas that there needs to be more information on, okay? Your explanation could be one sentence, it could be 2, 3, It just depends on how much you feel like you have to say. And the more you practice explaining ideas, the better you're going to get at it. The next part, step 3, is that concession. Now, I know the word concession, a lot of times we talk about like when you go to the movie theater, you go to the concession stand to buy popcorn and candy and soda. In this case, when we're talking about concession, it's basically saying that you're acknowledging that some part of their argument is correct, some part of that counter-argument is correct, or perhaps that it's logical in some sense. Think about if you're having an argument with a friend, or maybe just a discussion. If you do not acknowledge that your friend at least has some validity, your friend's probably going to end up being a little bit frustrated, right? And sometimes when we're having a discussion, it's not so much about who is right, but acknowledging that someone has a valid opinion. So that's what we're kind of doing with that concession, is saying, hey, you have a valid opinion. After that, we want to have that refutation. When we begin the refutation, because we're going to be going from a concession over to the refutation, a lot of times we want to use a transition word that helps us switch between ideas like but, however, etc., because we're going into a completely different idea. That refutation is, you're going to try to find something that is incorrect with their argument or doesn't apply or something like that. You kind of have to think about it and ponder and do a little research maybe, okay? So that's what that refutation is you've stated their argument, you've explained it, you've said, okay, well, this is fair. However, this part doesn't apply, or this part is incorrect, or they didn't consider this. You want to kind of do a little bit of that, okay? And then the last part of your counter argument and refutation paragraph is your evidence. Basically, you're going to want to find some proof that your refutation is correct, that it is true. The two main ways that students typically use evidence is that they're going to go and find, an article and find a quote or maybe some data, something like that. That's a great piece of evidence. It's credible. You have to make sure you use a credible source, of course, but that can be a great way to back up your refutation. You can also kind of talk us through the logic of the refutation, why this applies and why it doesn't. And that requires some more explanation. You might use some hypotheticals in there as well, okay? So those are our 5 steps. This doesn't mean that you can't put other things in your counter-argument and refutation paragraph, but these are the 5 things that I recommend that you have to have, bare minimum, okay? So try to put these in and see how your counter-argument and refutation paragraph goes based on putting those in your paragraph. Now we're going to take a look at an example. I'm going to kind of walk you through the steps of the counter-argument and refutation paragraph. So just to to reiterate, first is the counter-argument, then you explain/paraphrase the counter-argument, you put your concession in, your refutation, and then evidence to support your refutation. For this example, I chose a topic that I'm interested in. It's the idea that a lot of times mass violence is committed by men, and many times it's because those men in some way have felt emasculated. So I'm interested in the connection between masculinity and in health and all of that, those topics, okay? So I did a little brainstorming to come up with some different topics I'm interested in here: male, gender, masculinity, violence as a result of emasculation. Just because you're a male does not mean you are less of a man. I think I meant just because you're a male does not mean you're less of something else. I think that was just my brainstorming, maybe I don't always write clearly in my brainstorming. You can not have emotions, you have to commit violence, you must commit violence to be more masculine. So just some ideas that I was throwing around. I ended up coming up with this thesis: men have to be taught how to balance their masculinity and mental health in order to be successful, non-violent members of society. So I talk about, in this essay, I would be talking about how to balance masculinity. So still having it, but balancing it with mental health and, making sure that everything is going okay. So the counter-argument I chose was, some would argue that men do not need to be masculine to be successful and happy. So this counter-argument says that the masculinity part isn't necessary. This part right here where it says some would argue, that's a very common way to start a counter-argument. So if you want to kind of use that as a template, that's a good, trick to use to get you started on the counter-argument. For my explanation, I said they would say that masculinity and femininity, for that matter, are societal constructs and are not essential for us to survive, nor are they essential for success and happiness. So just giving a little bit more information on that. My concession was, it is true that men do not need to be masculine, and there are, in fact, many men who are not masculine. American society has been in the process of changing gender constructions, and there are a good deal of both men and women who do not feel constricted in masculine or feminine ideals. My refutation, though, I said, although this is true, it's still, their argument isn't quite working. While there are many men in our society who do not feel it is important to be masculine, one cannot discount the men who value their masculinity. Our society cannot expect these men to change such a large part of their identities in a short period of time. However, we can work to allow more men to be masculine in healthy ways. So it says we can't really expect people to get rid of their masculinity. If that's part of who they are, that's not really fair to ask them to just get rid of that. You'll notice here at the start of the refutation, I used while. That is a good way to go from the concession, which was one idea, into the refutation, which is sort of an opposing idea. And then my evidence, I will be honest, I just made up this quote, but this would be some sort of quote that I'd be looking for, is to say something like this if I were researching for evidence. Men feel happier when they have power and are not emasculated. And then I included my pretend parenthetical citation. So that's it, kind of written out as a list. I'm a big list person, so I write it out as a list first. And then I move it over into the paragraph. So we'll go ahead and read that real quick. Some argue that men do not need to be masculine in order to be successful and happy. They would say that masculinity and femininity, for that matter, are societal constructs and are not essential for us to survive, nor are they essential for success and happiness. It is true that men do not need to be masculine. There are, in fact, many men who are not masculine. American society has been in the process of changing gender constructions, and there are a good deal of men, both men and women, who do not feel constricted in masculine or feminine ideals. While there are many men in our society who do not feel it is important to be masculine, one cannot discount the men who value their masculinity. Our society cannot expect these men to change such a large part of their identities in a short period of time, and I might add, or at all. However, we can work to allow men to be masculine in healthy ways. It must be noted that men feel happier when they have power and are not emasculated. Yardley 23. Overall, as a society, it is good that many men do not feel the need to fulfill gender roles, but we must work to help the men who feel happy when they feel masculine to accomplish this masculine feeling without the use of anger and violence. Okay, so that gives us that full paragraph there. Okay, we see that it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 sentences long. So that's a pretty good paragraph size, especially for college level writing. 9 sentences is a decent length. All right, so there's an example to work from. In the last part of this video, I want to walk you through some practice exercises if you want to do a little bit of practice with counter-arguments and refutations. What I will do is give you some time to look at this screen, but I'd advise pausing for each practice exercise, pausing the video, reading it through, and then when you're finished, you can unpause and go to the next one. Okay, so here's your instructions. Practice writing counter-arguments and refutations with the following excerpts from Animal, Vegetable, Miracle. And this is a book that I like. It's by Barbara Kingsolver. In the book, she talks a lot about kind of becoming more involved with her food and growing food and making food and things like that, and how our society in the United States has changed and how we don't have as much connection with food, but we should. So some of the quotes in here for this practice exercise are related to those ideas. Okay, so back to the instructions. Remember that you must first identify Kingsolver's argument in the excerpt, then write a counter-argument to Kingsolver's argument, and finally write a refutation to your counter-argument. Now, I did give you those 5 steps if you want to practice with the full paragraph, but at the very least, I would advise practicing writing the counter-argument and then practicing the refutation. Those are the 2 most important parts of the paragraph. So if you don't have time to do all 5 steps of the counter-argument paragraph, just do those 2. All right, so here's our first practice exercise, the first excerpt from Animal, Vegetable, Miracle. Many bright people are really in the dark about vegetable life. Biology teachers face kids in classrooms who may not even believe in the metamorphosis of bud to flower to fruit to seed, but rather some continuum of pansies becoming petunias, becoming chrysanthemums. That's the only reality they witness as landscapers come to campuses and city parks and surreptitiously yank out one flower before it fades from its prime, replacing it with another. Kingsolver 11. So the first thing you want to do when you're practicing is you want to find the argument in this excerpt. What's the main argument? Then write a counter-argument for it, and then a refutation. pause the video now and do that. Moving on to excerpt number 2 and practice number 2. Nowhere else on earth has it become normal to layer on the love handles as we do. Other well-fed populations have had better luck controlling caloric excess through culture and custom. Italians eat Italian food, the Japanese eat Japanese, and so on, honoring ancient synergies between what their land can give and what their bodies need. Strong food cultures are both aesthetic and functional, keeping the quality and quantity of foods consumed relatively consistent from one generation to the next. And so, while the economies of many Western countries expanded massively in the late 20th century, their citizens did not. That's from Kingsolver 15. So go ahead and pause the video now. Find the argument of this excerpt, write a counterargument, and a refutation. And our last excerpt and last practice. Step 1 to achieving a genuine food culture is to live on the land that feeds them, or at least on the same continent, ideally the same region. Step 2 is to be able to countenance the ideas of food and dirt in the same sentence. And 3 is to start poking into one's supply chain to learn where things are coming from. Kingsolver 20. So again, for this practice, figure out what the argument is in this excerpt, write a counter-argument for it, and then a refutation to that counter-argument. All right, so I hope that helped you with your counter-argument and refutation paragraphs. If you liked the quotes from the practice exercise, I definitely recommend that you go and check out Kingsolver's book. It's a great book to read. It's very informational. You learn a lot, and she has a great style in writing about food and things like that. So if you have any more questions or you need any more practice, just contact me and I can help you out a little more. All right, thanks. See you next time.